Hi all, Yuri here from BOS. Today we're speaking with Dr. Emily Trunnell, neuroscientist, research associate, and an institutional animal care and use committee liaison for People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA. Dr. Trunnell has previously performed experiments on animals and now works with government agencies and other scientists to replace the use of animals with superior research methods. Welcome, Dr. Trunnell. So glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work?
Absolutely. So you covered the general overview. So I received my doctorate in neuroscience in 2016 from the University of Georgia here in the U.S. And for that doctorate, I did experiments on mice and rats. And during that time, I really came to see not only how I didn't agree with it ethically. I'm handling these animals every day, and you get to learn that they're individuals who value their own lives. So it really started to weigh on me towards the end of my time. And that's when I also really came to know that the results from animal experiments don't translate to humans. So I knew when I got finished I wanted to do something completely different and advocate for animals instead. And so I joined PETA right away after finishing my doctorate. And at PETA I mostly work on a policy level with regulators, government officials, to reduce the use and eventually eliminate the use of animals in experiments with policy changes. I also work with scientific journals, because the currency in the scientific community is getting your papers published. And if we can stop the worst animal experiments from getting published, that would be a big deterrent, so people wouldn't want to do them in the first place. So I work with journals to update their policies. And I also do general research about the efficacy of animal experiments and research as well for PETA, some of PETA's undercover investigations. When we have someone who's been in a laboratory doing an investigation, they may find that there are certain types of experiments happening. For example, muscular dystrophy experiments on dogs or sepsis experiments on mice. So I'll evaluate the evidence of whether those experiments are helping humans. They're always not, but we like to put that together to really make a complete case, along with the cruelty aspect of it, of why such experiments should be stopped. And I also liaise with so a big part of my job is building connections with the groups that oversee animal experiments at universities and companies, so that we can try to prevent the worst animal experiments from even being approved in the first place.
I saw this video where you talked about 95% of drug tested with animals fail when they're tested on humans. So it's basically useless, or do they ever succeed at all?
Well, 5% of the time. So in the U.S. at least, and I know some other places as well, the FDA currently requires that new drugs go through animal testing before they're approved to enter human trials. That was a little different with the COVID vaccine. They actually said that they could go ahead with human trials before the animal trials were finished. I think that really, hopefully, will set a precedent and kind of says something about, when we're in such a rush to get a medical product out there, a vaccine or a medicine, and we have everybody pushing and everybody behind it, we don't really need those results from the animal test to feel comfortable going forward. So you're right, 95% of those new drugs that have gone through animal testing fail in human trials. And the 5% that succeed, they didn't necessarily succeed because of the animal test. They succeeded because they were successful in humans. So very, very few things succeed 95% of the time and keep getting the green light. So it's something that we hope to make people more aware of.
And you mentioned that you can do whatever you want with an animal, and I'm thinking also, like you mentioned this. I mean, they did the trials with corona vaccine, and in general, if they try to make a vaccine for a harmful virus, and they manage to make the animal survive and actually have use of the vaccine, I mean, it's at least effective for the animal, do they still kill the animal after that?
Yes, the vast majority of animals are either killed at the end of an experiment. That's especially true for mice and rats. They're almost never reused, and they make up 95 to 99% of the animals used are mice and rats, over 100 million per year. It's just it's a problem because they're so inexpensive and easy to breed. You just want a fresh mouse or a rat for every new experiment. Oftentimes other animals like dogs and non-human primates, they are most often killed at the end of experiments. Sometimes dogs and primates can be reused over and over again. And, you know, that's more suffering for the animal, and also that animal has had experimental drugs injected, experimental therapies tested on them, and then you're bringing them into another experiment. Like, there's going to be things that are going to confound that new experiment and make it, less applicable to humans and even to other dogs, because that dog has been through a whole series, that dog or that monkey has been through a whole series of other tests beforehand, and it's not exactly representative of its species or humans.
Yeah. So they never get to be released or anything. It's always, or I mean, they don't even get to live. They just, okay, now they're done. We have done all the experiments we can. Then it's game over for them.
Usually, there are cases, and it's typically dogs, sometimes cats. I know of a few instances with rats, where the animals have been adopted after experiments. Most often, though, so in an experiment, you'll have animals that are being given a test substance and animals who are in the control group. A lot of times, it's those control group animals that are later can be later adopted. I know some people who have adopted dogs from research laboratories, and they come out of the cage and it's the first time their feet have ever touched the grass. And they have a lot of behavioral, mental health issues that they deal with for the rest of their lives because of the way that they were, brought into the world and treated in a laboratory. Sometimes primates can be retired to sanctuaries, and that's happening especially for chimpanzees in the US, because the US government recently, or it's been a few years now, but they made the good decision to stop using chimpanzees in experiments, and they've been working very slowly to get those chimpanzees to sanctuaries. But for the vast majority, the animals are killed at the end. Yes.
Yeah, that's really heartbreaking to think about. Like, they never seen anything, basically. No,
Yeah, I mean,
natural habitat.
The mice and the rats are bred in a facility, shipped to another facility, and all they see their whole life is the inside of a plastic cage and somebody's hands that are probably doing horrible things to them. It's really, really hard to imagine.
It reminds me of, in Sweden, they just made like a policy of the companies that have chicken farms and pig farms. I'm not sure if it was on both for the chickens and for the pigs, but they sealed up all the windows because in case someone takes pictures. So they never even see the sunlight. It's that's so incredible. I'm just yeah. But how did you get into neuroscience and pursuing the PhD, and what made you go that path in life? Did you have like a dream as a child to be a doctor, or?
My dream as a child was to be a photographer or a journalist, but once I started taking university courses, I really quickly came to realize how much I loved biology, and learning about how our body systems work. And the neuroscience program that I entered at the University of Georgia was really appealing to me because it was a very interdisciplinary group. So I got to collaborate with people not only in neuroscience, but in genetics and physiology. And my interest and my goal was to take sort of a holistic approach to understanding how the brain works, and how the brain interacts with other systems of the body. So I specifically studied how diet, a high-fat diet, can affect how your brain remembers, how your brain processes and creates new memories, and how the genetics that control those processes. And it was really fascinating, and I enjoyed doing that. I've always wanted to just know, once I get into something, I'm just like, I want to know more and more and more. I want to know more about this than anyone else. And so in that way, what I was doing was really fascinating, and I was encouraged to, explore, like, think of a new research question. What's something that nobody's answered before? And let's try to answer that. So all that was good, but it was only after the experiment was done, when I was trying to, write up the paper to be published, or write my dissertation, or think of a way to write to get a grant for more money for research. It was only then that it was like, oh yeah, you have to add something in there about how this applies to humans and human diseases and how this is going to help people. And once I started thinking about that, like, well, that should have been justified from the very beginning, especially when an experiment is involving harm to someone else, whether that's a human or an animal. It should go through the most rigorous justification. And the more animals that I used and killed, the less relevant I realized what I was doing was. It was just really kind of a disconnect. But neuroscience in itself is fascinating, and there's plenty of ways to do neuroscience without using animals. I just wish I'd been exposed to those earlier in my career. I was told, if you don't publish, when you're submitting a paper to be published to a journal, if there's no in vivo animal experiments in there, the journal isn't going to want to publish it. And that's really just not true. That's a misconception. So there are plenty of ways to do neuroscience without animals.
So a different question just popped up in my head. Like, you mentioned neuroscience, and that's you know a lot about that. So I imagine you have some thoughts about these. Have you heard about the experiments Elon Musk does on pigs for making microchips for human brains?
Yeah,
like,
pigs and monkeys.
Oh.
Yeah, unfortunately. From what I've read, I've read about those experiments some, and from what I understand, he's trying to do something that seems really fancy, and it is really fancy, but the scientists who have worked under him, they've come out in the media and pretty much said he has no idea what he's doing. Like, this is, well, first of all, he's doing something that other people have already done. And so it's not really anything new. He's just, trying to do it in a way that seems very high tech. And it's not been proven. And it's not like the research itself, from what I understand, hearing from the scientists who have worked in the laboratories, that that he owns is that he doesn't seem to care about the scientific process at all. So we don't even know if the results that are coming out are real or reproducible. So I don't put a lot of stock in it. It's for media.
And he compared his experiments to the other ones that people have done, and said that that was kind of like really primitive, like almost, you know, just very primitive, and didn't even give any results. So, but basically his research is the same. That doesn't give
Pretty much.
much
He's
results at
just
all.
doing the Bluetooth version of it.
Yeah.
It's not. Yeah, it's.
So enough about Elon Musk. How did you get into animal rights, and how long have you been an activist?
Well, I first became vegan in 2007. So that was quite a while ago now. And I was vegan for most of 10 years before I really became, I was dietary vegan because I went in, and I did experiments on animals, and I didn't really understand all of animal rights or all the ways that animals were used and exploited. Even when I was, going into the lab to experiment on animals, I would bring in vegan muffins for everybody to try because, of course, you shouldn't eat animals. There are other alternatives. But when I was trying to decide, so I knew I didn't want to keep doing research using animals. I wasn't sure quite what I wanted to do with my doctorate. And I thought about getting into, I enjoy writing. I'm decent at writing, not as good as I thought I was at the time, but I thought I might get into writing and editing. And I saw randomly a position at PETA for an editor. And I was like, I kind of like to learn more about animal rights. This would be something that I could do while I'm trying to figure out whatever else I want to do. And the PETA senior vice president, who's now my boss, called me and was like, I see you have a PhD in neuroscience. Would you be interested in ending animal experiments? And I was like, I didn't even know that PETA hired scientists, that PETA had a science team. I think most people don't know that. We actually have more scientists on staff than any other animal protection organization. And so I started looking about the papers they published, and I was just blown away. But I was worried that if I became an animal rights activist, that I would be sort of blackballed from the scientific community. And I didn't know if I really thought, I knew what I had done to animals wasn't right, that there was no good justification for it, but I didn't know whether or not I believed that all animal experimentation was bad. There are horrible diseases out there that affect humans and children and animals. So I just didn't know how I felt about that. And I was just talking it through and through and through with my husband. And he said something that really stuck with me. He said, even if animal research could cure humans, which I now know from the data, vast majority of the time it can't. But even if it could, it's not really their burden to bear. And that stuck with me. And I knew once I heard that that's what I believed in my soul. It's not their burden to bear our diseases to be our test subjects. They don't owe us anything. They have a right to their own existence. And I think in that moment, I became an animal rights activist. And I said yes to the job at PETA.
Did you ever fear people opposing like the animal rights and animal liberation you were working for, or did you feel that they're trying to silence your work somehow? Or
definitely, it's hard to work from this side within the scientific community. It's hard to get a seat at the table, especially when you come, with an animal rights organization on your name tag. They think you don't know what you're talking about, and there is a large fear. I mean, among all animal abusing industries, the meat industry, the clothing industry, the animal experiment, or the research industry, there's a history there that people want to, maintain the status quo and keep doing what they're doing. You have people that have built their entire research career on, a genetically modified mouse. And you come along and tell them, everything you've been doing for 30 years is completely useless. Nobody wants to hear that. And that's understandable from a psychological perspective. So it's hard to get a seat at the table to actually discuss the science of things. When we come in and complain about animal experiments and give all the scientific evidence about, why human relevant methods should be funded instead of animal experiments, we're deferred to, oh, if you have worries about animal welfare, you go see this department. It's like, no, we're actually talking about the science. So we are silenced. It is very challenging, but it's getting less and less so. We're chiseling our way in there. The more new papers are coming out every day that the whole scientific community sees. It's like, oh, by the way, we've been using this animal model for 20 years and it really hasn't given us anything. Maybe we should do something different. And that's more and more every day. And the technologies that we're able to use to replace animals are better and better every day. So I'm just pushing forward to the future because I think it's only going to get easier.
What kind of ways are there opposing to the conventional just animal testing? I heard about programmable models and maybe doing things from a blood sample. How do you do a more ethical kind of experiments?
So there are a lot of methods. There traditionally, and there have always been, the use of humans themselves, and not invasive, dangerous experiments, but human imaging, human epidemiological data. One thing that came out recently, that the NIH, which is the primary funder of research in the U.S., they fund less prevention and community-based research that really has an impact to offer services to people in a community or study population dynamics that affect disease. They fund those types of experiments less than they do, the really hard molecular stuff, which is a problem because those are real world things that can help people immediately if we just help give people more access to tools and technologies that already exist. So there are those things, and there have always been those things, and they're becoming more and more advanced. And when it comes to more molecular experiments, which animals are often used for, like trying to, what's the gene involved in this, or what's the immune system pathway that contributes to this disease, we're more and more able to use human cells and tissues for that. We can grow tissues three-dimensionally in labs now, so it's not just a few cells on a petri dish. They're actual tissues that work and look like they do from the human body. There are things called organs on chips, which I think are really exciting. They're like the size of a computer, like a flash drive, and they're little devices that mimic the physiological environment of the human body. So if you imagine the lungs, the way the lungs work is because of pressure systems. Well, they can create these pressure systems in the chip, and they're lined with human cells, and they can be used for drug testing. You can even, in some instances, people are using cells from an actual patient, because certain diseases, like schizophrenia or certain cancers, are really individualized to a person, and a treatment that may work on them may not work on somebody else. So you can take a sample of skin cells and reprogram those cells, put them in the chip, and sort of test drugs and treatments in a very individualized way. And then there are, we're getting more and more advanced with computer modeling. We know so much about human biology now, and to be able to harness, high throughput computer systems and mathematical models to sort of predict and understand that better is, that's definitely more advanced than it's ever been. So there are lots of different methods to answer different research questions.
So could we basically stop animal testing altogether?
Yes,
or what stops us from taking that step towards no animal testing?
That's a good question. I think a big part of it is, what I mentioned earlier about, this has been certain people's careers for their entire lives. And they are heavily invested in what they're doing. So there's kind of two areas of research. There's regulatory and there's non-regulatory. And most of what I've been talking about is non-regulatory research. And that just means there's not a mandate for it to be done. It's sort of, we're trying to understand something. This is like curiosity based. We're trying to learn more about a disease. All of that, with the statistic that 95% of it isn't leading to anything for humans, that could be stopped. There's no reason to keep throwing good money after bad, keep funding things that have failed time and time again. For regulatory research, that's things like toxicity testing for chemicals. So a new chemical or a new product, then we want to make sure it's not toxic for humans or not toxic in the waterways. Those in that area of research, that does absolutely need to be done. And we need to make sure that things are safe for humans and for the environment and other animals. And there are lots of non-animal methods to replace animals in the area now. A big roadblock is that the FDA and other agencies are very slow to approve them. They're not in any hurry. And if they were in a hurry, we could do a lot to replace animal testing in that sort of area of research as well.
So I saw this clip with the forced swim test, and I'm thinking, it was towards making sure that antidepressive were working and, as some kind of a guarantee, but it was kind of false misleading, or did it give any information at all? Or was it totally a failure?
The forced swim test, that's been a major project of mine for the last few years. It was designed and thought of as a way to tell, like you said, whether an antidepressant, whether like a drug or a compound might be antidepressant for humans. So they'd give a mouse or a rat, they'd inject them with a drug, put them in a tank of water, and supposedly if a drug is antidepressant, it will make them swim for longer instead of just starting to float. And that was based off the fact that when they did that with some of the first antidepressants that were ever developed, it worked. It worked. They said these drugs that are antidepressant in humans, when we give them to the mice, this is what happens. And for some classes of antidepressants, that works sometimes. But overall, it's a really unreliable test. So you have to change the parameters of the test if you want it to get it to work in a rat. You have to change the parameters if you want, a different type of drug to be tested. You can't use certain strains of animals. You have to keep the water at a certain temperature, a certain depth. The lighting in the room might change the result. All of these things, it's pretty much they are manipulating the experiment to sort of try to get exactly the answer they want. And that's not really how science works. If a result is true, those tiny little things shouldn't really matter. And we did a study recently. We looked at, this test began to be used by pharmaceutical companies to sort of screen compounds that were like, hey, we got this new drug, let's see what it might be useful for. Hey, it does this in the forced swim test, maybe it's an antidepressant. So we went and looked at, what are all these drugs that have been screened by these companies in the forced swim test, and did they go on to be antidepressants? And we found 109 compounds tested by 15 companies, and none of them, 0, went on to become antidepressants. So it's really, it's just kind of this thing that became, it was just so easy to perform, and people think they're going to get a certain result from it. So it just gets thrown into all these experiments like, hey, let's see if, you know, grapeseed extract is antidepressant in rats, and we'll get a paper out of it. So we've been challenging the use of that test. It's been written about a lot in the scientific community about how unreliable it is, and how this isn't a good drug screen. It doesn't, some people say it models depression, and that's just even more far-fetched. So after putting together this data, we were able to contact the companies that we looked at their data, and we've now gotten 15 companies. Most of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, like Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb, GlaxoSmithKline, to stop using the forced swim test. So that will hopefully soon be a thing of the past. But it's just another example of how something will get put out there in the literature and it'll catch on, and nobody is made to stop and systematically really like review whether or not this is useful. It's just like, of course it is, because he said it is, so I'm going to do it also. It just kind of epitomizes one of the major issues with the research industry.
And I mean, it's also important that, as you mentioned, that everyone does this tests in the same way, with the same lighting, the same depth in the water and everything. And have you observed in the research methodology and techniques used, like, are there differences in the institutions?
Yes, I mean, that's how we kind of get these results. You know, one research group will be like, oh, we tested Prozac in this mouse and it worked. And then another group at another university, oh, well, it didn't work for us. Oh, well, you must have, you know, had a male technician handling the mice and not a female technician handling the mice. It's like, that if this is really a model for something, that shouldn't matter. It's just, it's not very scientific.
So your involvement in like animal rights and advocating for animals, like, do you have any special moments that you feel were memorable or like a great success in your struggle to help animals?
Well, I think the one you highlighted, the forced swim test, has been very impactful for me, partially because when I was in graduate school, you know, participating in animal experiments, we would every week we'd have what's called a journal club, where the whole department would get together and we'd read a paper from another research group, and everybody would sort of critique it and analyze it, and it really kind of helps you to learn like how to construct experiments, and also what people are doing in the world of neuroscience. And every time there was a paper that had a forced swim test experiment, my professors, the head professors in my department would just be like, oh, forced swim test again. Why do people keep doing this? It's so dumb. How can they think that it models depression? And it just really stuck out to me. Like, this is something that's being done to animals and getting published in, you know, top journals, and it's not even a good method. So I knew it was really something that I wanted to tackle when I came to PETA, and those getting all those companies to commit to never do it again. I mean, not only if you watch video of the experiment, it sounds, you know, if I describe it, it sounds, well, if experimenters describe it, they say, the mouse is gently placed in a warm beaker of water. They swim around for a few minutes and they're taken out, gently dried. It sounds like, you know, they're getting a day at the spa. But if you watch a video of it, the animals are terrified. And if that was a dog or a cat being dropped into a pool, you know, the mice and rats are like clinging on to the experimenter's hand. If that were happening to another animal, there would be outrage. I mean, So those victories, mean at those companies at least, that will never happen to animals again. It's terrifying. Um, and it also means it's been, I think, hard for the animal rights community and animal advocates to get victories like these, or to get a seat at the table at pharmaceutical companies. They've historically really kind of blocked us out. But getting this small win, I think, sets a precedent and helps us get a seat at the table for more wins in that area, which I think is important.
So having an insight as you do, and I mean, you have experience, and being a doctor, does that give you more power to argue for animal rights or animal liberation?
I hope so. I hope, I do regret, what I did to get my doctorate, but I hope that I can use it now to speak out for animals. And I do think, when you sign a letter, Emily Trunnell, PhD, or something like that, it does have more of an impact. And I think we need more scientists, animal advocates in the community. I think sometimes scientists have a hard time, even if they believe the same things. It can be hard to speak out because it's really the history and the pressure within the scientific community not to call out other people, not to challenge the status quo. But I think, coming at animal advocacy from a scientific perspective, because it's not, it is the ethics, but it's not just the ethics for animals. It's the ethics of, how many people are dying of cancer and heart disease every day, yet we're pumping over half the research budget into failing experiments on animals. So I think coming at it from that perspective is helpful, and having, the authority of being a scientist, I hope that will help our cause.
I myself have protested against animal cruelty in animal testing here in Sweden many times, and I'm thinking, I mean, they just changed their policy and said that they're going to do experiments in a different city or town, and that kind of took the air out of the balloon, so to speak. And our group that were consistently doing demonstrations, we just stopped, because if media would come there, interview us, which they did many times, they would just say, okay, so are they doing these experiments here? No. Oh, they're doing them over in half the way through Sweden, to the southwest. So it felt like we lost that battle. But also, is it doing anything other than in my situation? Or I mean, does it help to do demonstrations, or do you think the real change is going to come from the professionals inside the industry, or
I think they're both equally so important. I think, the way it seems to work at PETA is, in a campaign, one way will work one time and the other way will work the next time. So, not to belabor the forced swim test, but to bring that in again, with some of the companies that I wrote to, I wrote to them in a letter and I laid out the evidence, the scientific evidence from their own publications. And some of them wrote back and were like, well, yeah, we absolutely, we won't do that again. For other companies, Pfizer, for example, we wrote time and time again, and they wouldn't budge. So we started demonstrating. We got a giant costume and stood in front of their headquarters in New York. And about a week later, they agreed. So sometimes people can be reached, we always like to approach people sort of behind closed doors first, to give them the chance to make the right decision when presented with the right evidence. And always try to be friendly first and do our due diligence to present the best scientific evidence. But some people won't budge, and it takes embarrassing them to make a change, and whatever works for the animals. And I think they are both so important because, especially for companies and universities, they don't want to be seen unfavorably by the public. So I think most of the hardest fought campaigns have been won through protesting. And I do understand it can be easy to get disheartened. I live in a small-ish town in the US, and I've tried to work with a small local group to protest in front of a pig slaughterhouse. And, we get one or two people to show up, and media never shows up. And it can just be like, why are we doing this? So it takes strategizing, and it can be disheartening, but I think in the long run, it all works, and it works together.
So I hear you're really passionate about caring for animals, and so you also been doing other sorts of activism, not only focusing on the science, but the meat industry, or maybe egg, or anything else. I don't know.
So yeah, and actually I helped to organize, so I live in Tennessee, and our town had never had a vegan fest or animal rights gear. There was a vegetarian festival that went on, but it was really just, kind of plant-based nutrition, which is great. But I helped to put on the first vegan fest, and we brought speakers about animal rights. And we had like phenomenal attendance, and really kind of got the message out there in our community. That, hey, there's animal issues that you should care about that you may not know about. So I try to work locally with my groups, and anything else that comes along. If PETA or another group has a protest that's happening nearby, I'll do my best to attend and give support.
Sounds like you're doing quite a lot. And how do you not get torn down by all the misery by animals? And I mean, like, you're working at PETA, so when you come home after a day of work, do you think about it, or can you like let it go and just relax, or what's going on?
It depends. I think for the most part, and I think in a way, my experience doing what I did to animals in the laboratory, I really had to compartmentalize, especially, I couldn't come home and think about what I did to animals, or I just wouldn't be able to get up in the morning. I had to sort of take that and put it in a box. And then my life at home was a different box, especially days where we had to euthanize the animals. Like, I just almost couldn't function at the end of that. And so I think that being able to do that is kind of essential to your mental health. And it's a skill that it shouldn't be overused. You don't want to just stuff all your feelings down, but you do, when you see animal cruelty all day, every day, and read about animal cruelty, you do have to kind of learn about putting it aside. And I think it helps to focus on the changes that we are trying to make. All this is happening, these terrible things are happening, but I'm doing something about it. I'm working every day to try to stop it. But sometimes there's a case that you can't get out of your head. And that's kind of part of the job as well. But I think you would just really have to focus on the goal, and all the other people that are doing amazing work around you who can support you and be there for you if you just want to get things off your chest. That's essential as well.
Being an activist myself for about 10 years now, I know it's hard to keep up and not lose hope and good spirit. And what would your advice be for animal rights activists on the long run, like me. I mean, there's plenty of others for, coping with it? It's a hard question, I know.
It is a hard question. I don't know that I'm the expert on this part of things. But I think it's important to understand when, you're getting broken down and you're getting compassion fatigue, and do something for yourself. Just because you're an animal rights activist, there's a want and a pressure and an internal want to be trying to do things for animals at every minute of the day, because they may have voices, but we're the only ones trying to listen to that. But if you get burnt out yourself, you're not going to be effective at helping those animals. You're gonna be burnt out. So you have to make yourself take time off, do things that aren't related to animal rights, take a vacation, have a day where you just watch dumb things on Netflix, that aren't. I get in this rut where I'm just like, well, no, I need to read this book, I need to watch this documentary, I need to know what's going on so I know how to help. But you can't do that all the time. So don't be ashamed and afraid to take time for yourself. I'm kind of forced to do it now. I have an almost 2-year-old. And so she kind of demands that I step away from that mentally and focus on happy things. And, not that there are not happy things in animal activism, because those exist as well. But I'd say, take time for yourself.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think there's like a better and a worse way, or like what do you think is the best way to do animal advocacy or animal liberation?
Oh, I don't think there's a best way. I think we have so many people working on different angles, so many different groups, people focused on different areas where animals exploited, people within, that's been something we've discussed today. We have people trying to help animals in laboratories, get animals out of laboratories. There's people who take direct action. There's people who, protest lawfully in the streets. There's people who write their Congress people, write to NIH, do the kind of things that I'm doing. And I don't think I think it all needs to happen. I don't think there's a better way or a right way. I think any way we can speak out for animals, it's going to reach a different audience. And that's important.
Do you have any like role model or celebrity you look up to that are fighting against speciesism?
That's a good question. No, I really admire PETA President Ingrid Newkirk. She's never afraid to sort of say the hard things. And she's really devoted her life to making waves for animals. And I also admire, the other scientists and the physicians in my community who, there's a scientist by the name of John Gluck, for example, and he was a primate experimenter, and he was trained in the laboratories of Harry Harlow, which is notorious experiments, where baby monkeys were ripped from their mothers. And he was trained to conduct those experiments and started his own lab. And, after decades in that space, came out and said, no, this is not right, and I'm not doing this anymore. So for someone to have the courage to challenge their entire career and their entire community is something that I really admire. I was, fresh out of graduate school, hadn't really built all that behind me yet, which I'm grateful for. But I think those things take a lot of courage.
So a bit of a different question, but I don't know exactly what you did last with Mira, but what kind of response did you get on the last project you did?
Well, let's see. One thing that we've been able to do recently, we've been working since 2016 to close a canine muscular dystrophy laboratory in Texas. And the university has really fought back on that and even spread lies about what they were and weren't doing, whether they were breeding these dogs to have muscular dystrophy. Recently we were able to get the lab to commit to stop breeding the dogs. And there's 20 dogs left in the lab, and one by one, we've been able to get healthy ones to be adopted out into loving homes. That's really kind of snowballing, I think, and hopefully we'll be able to get all those dogs out soon.
That's really good. I had a thought about something you said, like, I don't remember exactly, but there was something about experiments, and then I thought, there's this someone who modified lab rats to become glow in the dark, basically. So there's some kind of fun decoration, and then he sold it as some kind of art, you know, really expensive, and had like a show. I think it was in New York, and I'm just thinking, like, okay, so that gets so much attention, but then the animal rights is totally in the shadows. So it's totally upside down. I'm just reflecting about it. I'm not asking anything, but it's just so weird that, you know, human priorities are like, oh, glow in the dark mouse, that's so cool. And then animals are suffering. Oh, what about the mouse? What do you think? The mouse likes being glowing? Like,
yeah, and what does this mouse want? I think part of the hard thing is people don't have a lot of sympathy for mice and rats. People see them as pests, you know, historically. And they're the vast majority, 95 to 99% of the animals used are mice and rats. And so I think experimenters use them because they're cheap and easy to breed and everything. And you know, they've been using them for so long. They have all these specialized equipment and these specialized mice. So people hear, you know, oh, well, we use animals in research, but it's just mice and rats. People are like, oh yeah, mice and rats, gross. Most of those people have never met a mouse or a rat. They're clean. They're super smart. They like to be tickled. They take care of their young. And you know, even if we didn't know those things about them, they have their own wants. They value their lives, and I think a hard part is that people just don't see, especially those animals, in that way. So I think education and outreach on that level is important as well.
So if you like imagine almost like a sci-fi movie or TV series, like in the future, like 100, 200 years in the future, what do you think people are thinking about animal testing that we've done? I mean, not, you know, and what would they say about animal testing? I mean, in case they don't do it anymore, then. I mean,
oh, they won't.
Yeah.
I'm confident. They won't be doing animal testing and that, especially that far in the future. And I know that it's going to be looked back on as really, you know, one of those horrible things from our history. There are, you know, we can look back on human experiments like that were less than a century ago. Tuskegee Experiments, if you've heard of those, where African-American men were given syphilis in order to study treatments for syphilis, and they weren't made aware that they were given syphilis. You know, the Nazi experiments, experiments on people that were held in internment camps. We look back at that time, experiments that were done on people with mental disabilities. We can look back on those now and be like, how in the world did anyone think that was okay? But at the time, those people were saying the same thing the animals experimenters are saying now. Well, we have no other way to do it. We have to see how this works. And the people who are being experimented on are treated like the heroes they are. They're giving something important to society. It's the same lines being used now, and we're going to look back on it in the same way.
And talking about Nazis, I mean, the shape they're building were, if you look in like photos from the air, it's the same structure as the animal industry. It's like,
Yeah.
So yeah, but thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate you sharing your story, and we've got a lot to think about. And thanks everyone for watching as well. We really appreciate your support.
Thank you.